E3 members excited to be here with Hill Goodspeed, the historian for the National Naval Aviation Museum here in Pensacola, Florida. And this is a two-part series where we talk with the director, Captain Sterling Gillum, about devotion, a little bit about the display we see behind here. But I wanted to talk to you today about Korea, naval aviation, ties to the Korean War, and then jump into the chosen reservoir. So if we can kind of like 50,000 foot view and then dive on down.
Sure. Well, naval aviation, pretty much like all the other military services after World War II, there was a massive drawdown. And so the fleets of carriers that were operating in the Atlantic and the Pacific theater during World War II were reduced greatly. And it was a period of great change leading up to the Korean War. Technologically, you had the introduction of jet aircraft. So the first gen jets for naval aviation, the F9F Panther, the F2H Banshee, and those that preceded them were taking shape. There was also really a question about what naval aviation's role was going to be in the nuclear age. Whether they even needed naval aviation. So there was a big inter-service battle between the Air Force and the Navy and Marine Corps about what the shape of things would be. And so the Navy was also looking at how do we get nuclear weapons on board carriers. But when the Korean War broke out, it was very much a diminished naval aviation as far as numbers than what it was at the end of World War II. Much like all the other services, Army and Air Force as well. So when the Korean War broke out, there was really, you think in this day and age, there's always a carrier presence everywhere. I mean, there was a single carrier in the Western Pacific, and that was the ship that was called into action, USS Valley Forge, to launch naval aviation's first strikes of the Korean War. And so in the early months of the Korean War, after the North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel into South Korea, naval aviation was doing a lot of close air support. There were some air-to-air engagements. The first jet versus jet kill in naval aviation occurred at that time. But primarily it was supporting the troops on the ground and also supporting the offensive up the Korean peninsula led by Douglas MacArthur when the forces landed at Incheon and the famous invasion in Incheon. So that's what naval aviation was doing, a lot of interdiction, close air support, and it's a mixture. You have jets here and the jet ages here, they're flying, but they're pretty limited in their capabilities as far as they can't carry a ton of ordnance. They're pretty underpowered by modern standards and comparisons. And so you have a lot of aircraft like the AD Skyraider, propeller-driven aircraft, and the f4u Corsair, as depicted behind us here, that were carrying the load as far as doing a lot of the close air support operations. But Korea is not a hospitable place. It's very rugged terrain, very dangerous low-level missions, but that's what they were doing day in and day out, supporting the troops on the ground and just trying as they made their way north.
It's funny, we have F-16 bases in Korea. I've never been stationed there. A lot of buddies who have, and flying in South Carolina, usually summertime, spring, you get like a low, hazy day, it's just kind of murky. And they always joke that's a Korea VFR day, so visual flight rules, like that's as good as it gets. But now I've flown into there in different planes. The weather is usually always bad.
Right.
If it's wintertime, there's snow, low cloud decks. If it's summertime and a nice day, it's not really a nice, clear day. So operating in that environment, in that time, in these type aircraft had to be incredibly challenging. And again, I can't even imagine what those guys went through when it came just navigating and finding the people on the ground they needed to support.
Right, and then there's coming back to the ship. I mean, especially in the cold weather. I mean, they'd have to wear these poopy suits, as they called them, which were very uncomfortable and made it a challenge. And even if you were wearing a poopy suit, your survivability, if you had to go into the drink, was, especially in the winter, it was your rate of survival. You had to be pulled from the water really quickly. And so there's the challenge of that, and you're absolutely right, the weather conditions, the cloud cover, the snow, particularly in the Chosin Reservoir campaign, just horrific conditions in which to fly. And you're in cockpits that are not really well insulated. You're actually launching in the case, you'd launch with, even in the jets, you would launch with the canopy open from the carrier. So it was something else.
Definitely a different time. I like to jump into the Chosin Reservoir specifically. Can you talk to me about that battle and then kind of how that ties into the exhibit we see here today?
I sure can. The Chosin Reservoir campaign, you have these battles in history that just go down because in history more than others because of just the against the odds nature of them. You know, the Bastogne in the Bulge, in the early stages of the Bulge in World War II, is one of them. And when it comes to Korea, it's the Chosin Reservoir because of all the factors involved. How the battle really came to be was after the landings at Incheon and the U.S. forces really enabled establishing a foothold in South Korea, and then Douglas MacArthur made the decision, we are going to push north. And they pushed all up into North Korea and really approached the Chinese border. And that's a short time before the Chosin Reservoir campaign is when the Chinese forces came across into North Korea and changed the landscape as far as the enemy strength that the U.S. was facing. So that's how it happened, just a rapid move north, and then in a relatively unexpected influx of Chinese forces. And then, so that's one element of it, was the overwhelming odds that came across as far as enemy manpower. The second facet of it was the weather. It was bitterly cold. Very mountainous, rugged terrain, sub-zero temperatures, snow, ice, and the Chosin Reservoir is actually a man-made lake there in North Korea, and there was really only one road passage out of that area. So you have an embattled 1st Marine Division facing and some Army units facing an overwhelming onslaught of Chinese forces and having to battle their way out of the area in a very limited roadway. So under constant attack, very limited supplies, not a lot of winter gear, and so it was just a test of their mettle and their spirit. And you know, the Marines, I would say, you know, they withdrew from the Chosin Reservoir, but to the press they said, we're not withdrawing, we're just attacking in the other direction. So that's as you would expect from Marines to say. But that was all those elements against the odds, just trying to get out of the area under just very austere conditions that just created a certain aura about that battle. And air support was vital. The flights of Jesse Brown and Thomas Hudner and all the Air Force pilots, naval aviators, both Navy pilots from ships offshore and Marine pilots flying in, helicopters delivering supplies. I mean, transport aircraft flying into makeshift runways just to deliver supplies and evacuate the wounded. Air support was vital, just to helping beat back the onslaught of the Chinese forces and enable those U.S. forces to make their way out.
Timeline-wise, with Jesse Brown's last flight, where does that fall in the midst of the battle?
It's pretty early on in the battle, but it really, the Chinese forces came across in November, but in early December is when the battle really intensified. So he and his squadron mates were involved pretty early on in the stages of the Chosin Reservoir battle.
Again, it's pretty incredible to hear these stories and be able to capture them. So I appreciate you taking the time just to kind of dig a little bit deeper into naval aviation during Korea as well as the Chosin Reservoir. So thank you again for taking the time.
Happy to do it. Thanks for having me.
Well, E3 members, again, I hope you enjoyed this, a little bit deeper dive into Korea and the Chosin Reservoir, which I think pairs well as we talk about devotion in the new Korea exhibit here at the museum. So we'll see you next time.